Good afternoon. I'm Ed Steinfeld. I'm the director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, and I am so delighted to be here today to celebrate Killer High. This fantastic new book by Peter Andreas. Let me just say, as a student of Chinese affairs, I hardly need to be told about the importance of the relationship between drugs and war. I, of course, know the intensity of feelings in China about the century of humiliation that began with the Opium War, but at the same time, it's easy for a lot of people, including myself, to think of something like the Opium War as maybe an anomaly or something very particular to a very particular time and place. And I have to say, I'm guilty of thinking about the Opium War that way. But great scholarship, truly great scholarship, like Killer High, like a lot of the work that's done here at the Watson Institute, forces me to see the world in a totally new way. This book has forced me, and I think it forces all readers, to really focus on the eternal and incredibly expansive relationship between drugs and war. That relationship extends from war conducted by people who are often on a form of drug, some kind of psychoactive substance. It extends to wars in conquest of drugs or the raw materials for drugs. It extends to wars for markets and for outlets for drugs, and of course, as we're all familiar with, wars against drugs. But as Peter argues so effectively, this phenomenon, this interaction between psychoactive substances and conflict just is laced throughout history and right up to the present. Peter makes a number of very interesting conclusions in this book, but also raises a number of questions. And I think we're going to have an opportunity today with this fantastic panel to delve into some of those questions, which will again emphasize this entirely new lens that Peter gives us to see the world. Let me quickly explain how we're going to proceed. I'm going to ask Peter to come up and speak for 10 minutes or so about the book, and then I'm going to ask our panelists each to comment for 10 minutes or so each on the book, and then we're going to open it up to questions and answers. If you will, let me briefly introduce Peter and our panelists. Peter Andreas is the John Hay Professor of International Studies here at the Watson Institute and at the Department of Political Science. He's the author, co-editor of 11 books, including, of course, Killer High, but also the 2013 book Smuggler Nation, How Illicit Trade Made America. Of course, quite relevant today as we live in a world of trade frictions and talk about piracy and make claims about a variety of countries' illicit activities. Next to speak will be Chris Chivers, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning long-form writer and journalist for the New York Times. I'm sure all of you are familiar with his work. I'm a big fan. He's worked at the New York Times since 1999. His career as a foreign correspondent has focused on conflict regions spanning Afghanistan, Iraq, the Palestinian territories, Chechnya, Libya, and Syria, among others. Chris also served as a Marine Corps infantryman and a combat veteran from the first Gulf War, the Persian Gulf War. Next to speak will be Angelica Duran-Martinez, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts-Lowell. Angelica is a 2013 PhD recipient from Brown, and she is a noted expert on Latin American and comparative politics, but with a particular emphasis on organized crime and criminality, illicit markets, and the relationship between state actors and non-state actors, often armed non-state actors. She's the author of the award-winning 2018 book, The Politics of Drug Violence, Criminals, Cops, and Politicians in Colombia and Mexico. That was from Oxford University Press. And Stephen Kinzer, well known to everybody here, is a senior fellow at the Watson Institute, and of course an award-winning journalist who, over the course of his career, covered more than 50 countries on 5 continents. Stephen spent more than 20 years working for the New York Times as a foreign correspondent and bureau chief, and among his numerous acclaimed books include the 2019 volume Poisoner in Chief, Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA Search for Mind Control, obviously topical for the discussion today. So with that, let me turn the microphone over to Peter Andreas. Congrats.
Thank you all for coming. If you are here because you think this is about the made-for-TV DVDs, Killer High, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I'm sure that DVD has and will outsell my book. The genre for that, I believe, listed on Amazon is horror / comedy. So my book is definitely horror. There's not a lot of comedy in it. In fact, the title Killer High has grown on me. It wasn't my selection. My choice for title originally was the subtitle of the book, A History of War in 6 Drugs. And let me just give you a few highlights of the book. What I try to do in a mere 300 and some pages is retell the history of warfare through the lens of drugs and retell the history of drugs through the lens of war. And hopefully, for those of you who end up reading the book, you'll not quite think of war again in the same way, and you won't quite think of drugs in the same way. In fact, I'd like to convince you that drugs and war grew up together and over time became quite addicted to each other. A one-liner would be drugs made war and war made drugs. These two things tend to be treated quite separately in the literatures on war and drugs, and so what I do is systematically try to tie them together across time, across place, and across psychoactive substance. The motivation for the book was not history. It was to bring history into what I consider a policy debate that suffers from a severe case of historical amnesia, a debate about the so-called nexus between drugs and conflict. We talk today about narco-states, and the first thing that comes to mind is Afghanistan. Or we think about narco-insurgents or narco-terrorists, and we think about Colombia and maybe also, again, Afghanistan. But looked at this issue from a much deeper historical sweep, going back not just years and decades, but even centuries, the first true narco-state is probably Great Britain. In fact, Great Britain's probably the first narco-empire. If you think about the sheer importance of alcohol taxes, the importance of the tea trade. That's a powerful drug. I'm addicted to it. It's called caffeine, not nicotine. Don't touch the stuff. Or the importance of the opium trade for the rise of Britain as the world's foremost maritime power. In fact, narco-insurgents, yes, it's the FARC, yes, it's the Taliban, but it was also George Washington. Why do I say George Washington? Well, that conflict very much depended on revenue generated by tobacco. In fact, got a loan from France based on tobacco revenue, and the Brits were so upset about it that they burned tobacco fields whenever they found them, including tobacco fields owned by Thomas Jefferson. So what I try to do in this book is systematically unravel, interrogate, unpack the relationship between drugs and war. And I actually find that there's 5 relationships. One is war while on drugs, literally combatant drug use in wartime, but not just combatant, but also on the home front as well, drug use by civilians dealing with coping with wartime. Obviously, war is stressful work. No surprise that drugs help soldiers cope. They also help them celebrate victories. They help them prepare for battle. They give them liquid courage, after all. I also talk about war through drugs. Totally different than war while on drugs. War through drugs meaning using drugs primarily to fund war. That ranges from alcohol and tobacco taxes to cocaine and opium revenue, the full gamut from licit to illicit drugs, natural to semi-synthetic to fully synthetic drugs, from the most benign to the most dangerous psychoactive substances. Then there's war for drugs, which is actually distinct from the first two. War for drugs is actually going to war over drug markets, and as Ed already mentioned, the most famous case of this, of course, are the opium wars of the mid-19th century, where Britain forced opium onto China through the barrel of a gun. But it goes all the way up to the present if we think about what's going on in Mexico today. More people have died in Mexico since late 2006 than have died in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. Drug violence that, although security analysts are reluctant to call it war, if you actually look at the sheer number of casualties, if you look at how well armed the perpetrators are using military-grade equipment, actually the actors themselves are often militarily trained, often defectors from the military. In one case, US-trained anti-drug force turned into a drug hit squad for drug trafficking organizations. And then you think about that the state itself has deployed its military in a front-line role in fighting drugs. The Mexican military is essentially an anti-drug force at this point. And then you say it's not just Mexico, but also Colombia to some extent, and also Brazil to some extent. And even the United States, since the 1980s, has loosened the Posse Comitatus Act, which restricted the use of the U.S. military for law enforcement purposes, now very much embedded in the war on drugs at the border and beyond. And just the proliferation also of militarized policing in our own communities. SWAT teams. SWAT teams were invented before the war on drugs, but really took off thanks to the war on drugs, and this is using military technologies, often ex-military personnel, and approaches to fighting a substance. There's the war against drugs, which is closely related but distinct than war for drugs. War against drugs started as a metaphor. Nixon declared war against drugs. He didn't actually send in troops to fight drugs. But since the 1980s, it's become progressively more militarized so that we could actually call it an outright war. And last but not least, and this is probably the research in the book that most surprised me, is drugs after war. How much war itself left a lasting legacy in terms of drug production, trafficking, regulation. Drug tastes have been fundamentally altered thanks to wars in ways that we often don't give war credit for. Just give you a few examples. Why are we a coffee drinking rather than a tea drinking nation? Because we won the American Revolution. The Brits went on with tea. We turned to coffee. We not only turned to coffee, we turned to whiskey. Rum was the drink of choice produced right here in Rhode Island before the American Revolution. The distilleries, which kept much of Rhode Island going, including in Massachusetts, never revived after the American Revolution. And whiskey became the alcoholic beverage of choice. It was a national drink. It no longer needed imports from abroad. It was considered patriotic to turn to whiskey, turn against that British drink, rum, turn against that British drink, tea. So our very tastes that we now just take for granted are actually a result of war. The very criminalization of cocaine is a product of World War II. Very few people remember that cocaine was legally produced by Japanese pharmaceutical companies, coca grown in Java. The destruction of those fields and the destruction of the Japanese pharmaceutical cocaine industry is part of the U.S. victory in World War II. The U.S. had turned against cocaine much earlier, of course, but it wasn't only with the victory of Japan that the U.S. was actually able to globalize its preference for cocaine prohibition. So cocaine was actually one of the biggest losers. Legal cocaine was one of the biggest losers of World War II. Illegal cocaine, decades later, was arguably one of the biggest winners. So those are the 5 relationships. Now I want to tell you just a little bit in the few minutes that I have what the 6 key drugs are, and I've already given you hints because I've mentioned some of them. The oldest, most multi-purpose, and arguably double-edged of the drugs is alcohol. It goes back, it's to beer and wine, and then the distilling revolution really did indeed revolutionize things. Just think about why France is the world's most famous wine-producing region in the world. It's the Roman conquest is what brought wine to France. Bordeaux was set up as a port by the Romans. After the Romans retreated and are pushed back, wine endures in France, right? The distilling revolution was absolutely essential to the conquest of the New World. Think about the importance of alcohol as an ethnic cleanser in westward expansion. In fact, hard alcohol became so important that it was actually rum rations on both sides of the American Revolution. After the Revolution, whiskey became part of U.S. military rations. In fact, the British, believe it or not, had rum rations until the early 1970s on their naval ships. Second drug, tobacco, arrives much later than alcohol, but once it arrives, equally potent. And in fact, none of the downsides of alcohol. Alcohol, basically, you can raise a lot of revenue, but you also might have a drunk military. The Tsar was able to finance the largest army, standing army in Europe with vodka revenue, but his soldiers were drunk. Tobacco is the ideal war drug. Highly portable, fights both anxiety and boredom, relieves, it is highly taxable, and doesn't impede performance, even if it might eventually kill you. The globalization of tobacco is intimately also about the spread of warfare. Soldiers globalized warfare, and the very mode of tobacco consumption was closely influenced by war. So why do we turn away from hookahs and pipes to cigars and then cigarettes, to increasingly portable, easily to produce, to move? This was an intimate story of war. In fact, cigarettes, by the time World War II came around, was the most valued ration in soldier rations. Third, caffeine. My drug of choice. I'm completely addicted to the stuff. It's the world's most popular psychoactive substance, but certainly far from a benign relationship to war. Arguably stimulated imperial expansion. I already mentioned the British Empire of tea. But then we also have the rise of caffeinated soldiers. It's fascinating that in the case of the U.S. Civil War, coffee is mentioned in soldier diaries more often than gun, cannon, or rifle. Right? Coffee is just this essential ingredient to keep soldiers going. Instant coffee was an instant hit on the battlefield in World War II and then outlived World War II. The coffee break was actually introduced for defense workers during World War II and then outlived World War II and institutionalized in the workplace in the 1950s. And then all the way up to today, the favorite beverage at military bases across the world are hyper-caffeinated beverages like Red Bull and Monster and so on. Fourth, opium. Ed already mentioned, opium wars are an extreme case of the relationship between war and drugs, which is war for drugs, imperial wars, but also, for example, the Japanese imperial occupation of China. There's no way that Japan in the late 1930s could fund its occupation of China without narcotics. Amphetamines, an extreme case of war while on drugs. Sun Tzu said speed is the essence of war. He did not mean amphetamines, but he'd be pretty impressed at how important amphetamines were to keep soldiers on many sides going during World War II. And then last but not least, cocaine, the extreme case of war against drugs, which I've already said a few things about. I'll stop there and turn things over to Chris.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to open with compliments. If you look at my copy all the way through, you can tell I was engaged. When I get to the end of the book and I've used up 2 ink pens, it's probably a sign it's a hell of a book. I was an early lucky reader. Peter got me a copy over Christmas, and I spent the holidays with it. It's a work of history, as you just heard. History is an act of making diverse and sometimes divergent sources cohere into an understanding and maybe a set of narratives that are relatable and analyses that can make you, as you said, reimagine the world and understand it anew, in this case, the world of war. And that was my experience of it, but I don't want to talk about history, at least not distant history. I want to talk more about now and some more recent observations since the Persian Gulf War of 1990 and 91 and the so-called, as the military calls it, global war on terror since 2001, and bring the events that Peter has related up to the present time. Are there any recent veterans in the room? Any? No? Well, maybe they'll, good, one, and there'll hopefully be some on C-SPAN, and you can fact-check me with some of what I'm going to say. I'll welcome you to comment afterward. But, you know, we talk about, or Peter talks about in the book and in his remarks, the place that various substances have on the battlefield. And the battlefields of the era that we live in now have changed a bit for modern conventional militaries. The war's become so technical, and the military commands have become, in some cases, so politically sensitive that some of the long-standing drugs on the battlefield are now prohibited. Alcohol, most notably, for a variety of reasons, although the military is a heavy user at the personal level of alcohol, at the individual level, at the unit level, when deployed. Alcohol, I'm not going to call it non-existent, because it's not, but it's almost invisible. It's quite rare. It's very unusual to see alcohol on the battlefield. Some of this is because the wars, as we've had them since 2001 and since the Gulf War, in fact, have often played out among Islamic populations. And there is a sensitivity to having the military make the social faux pas of ingesting alcohol in a country where they have been, in some cases, invited, in other cases are occupied, but in any case are hoping to get along with the population better than what they otherwise might. So there is still alcohol on the battlefield, but you won't see much of it. You got to look. When I was in the 80s and 90s, there were, among the troops, I was in the Marine Infantry, these things called snake bite kits, which was a euphemism, a joke, and it was, people would have sent to them shampoo bottles, perhaps, with a little bourbon in it, but it was quite guarded. It was very obvious, as you know, because most everyone here has some sort of relationship with alcohol. It's very hard to hide alcohol use, you know, the odor. So I remember one snake bite kit being broken out on a warship that I was on, but they literally locked the doors, and someone said, "I just got bit by a fucking snake," and pulled out a bottle, and everyone got like a couple of shots, and that was it on a 10-month deployment. There wasn't much alcohol there at all. But there are many other drugs out there, and there's a deep hypocrisy that you would see in how the military, our military, and Western militaries in general relate with drugs in their own forces versus into their allied forces. And what I mean by that is, since the failed hostage rescue attempt late in the Carter administration, in which drug use was given part of the blame for the failure, for the mechanical failure of the aircraft, there was a story that circulated in the military in the years after that a sailor had been smoking pot in a hangar deck and had caused a small fire in a garbage can, and this had activated a sprinkler system which had sprayed some salt water on some of the aircraft, and this was considered perhaps a culprit in one of the aircraft's failures on the mission. Whether the story is apocryphal, I haven't done the deep dive research to tell you, but it was widely trafficked when I was in, and we had, as a result, had gone to a service that, coming out of Vietnam, used marijuana very heavily, that now had drug testing, routine, regular urinalysis, sometimes randomized. You know, they would do things like take a unit and pull numbers out of a hat and say, if your Social Security ends in 5 or 7, then you all have to report to the first sergeant for urinalysis today. And it was not quite zero tolerance. You were given 2 chances, but you would be prosecuted on the first chance and discharged, or on the first hit, and discharged on the second with a negative discharge that could affect you for the rest of your life. So the use of marijuana really fell off in the 80s. In our force, in the Western forces, but when you go to the battlefields now, you will find the Allies may be heavily using. And some of you said that your book is horror over comedy. Some of the scenes I saw in Afghanistan you would qualify as comedy. There would be tents alongside each other with Americans or Western forces in one and the Afghan partners in the other. And the Americans would all be dipping Copenhagen, which is a tobacco snuff that basically tastes like cow shit. But it's incredibly popular and it's very useful because it's hands-free and it's smokeless, so people can take it on patrols, or you can operate a vehicle, a rifle, a radio, any number of things with it. And you don't have to fumble with matches. And so it's immensely popular. So everyone in the American tent would likely be using tobacco, and some caffeine. Monsters and Rippets were immensely popular. And in the Afghan tent, literally smoke billowing out of it from hashish or marijuana. Hashish use was universal, I would say, among the Afghan units. Maybe not among every Afghan, but in every unit. It was impossible not to smell it, not to see it, and it was openly used. And of course, there's traffic between the two tents, so many of the Americans were going into the Afghan tent and getting high. And then episodically, we'll call it provincially, depending on which province an American service member might be assigned to, the agriculture. Afghanistan has many different climates, so it has many different agricultural products. And in some areas, some regions of Afghanistan, marijuana is grown extensively. And so if you're in the mountains, you wouldn't see this marijuana growing. But if you were down in the irrigated steppe, you would see massive marijuana fields, and troops would patrol it and through it and pick it, and many of them would smoke it. And I know some units that had heavy marijuana use, so heavy that the commanders kind of had to wink at it and be careful about not having drug tests, because they would have had to discharge the entire unit or punish the entire unit. And there's one story that's related to me by a close friend of mine who was in the Corps. I was a journalist at this point, often with the Marine Corps, but this former Marine, was a urine donor when the test came along. He was clean, and he would donate urine to his friends, particularly in the mortar pit. The mortar unit was high all the time, basically a baked mortar unit, and he would donate his urine so that his friends wouldn't get hammered, by the rules. But hash and pot, while they were, very common on the battlefield, were mostly isolated to the Afghans. And this creates situations of hypocrisy, where we, on the one hand, have something like a zero-tolerance policy for our force, but our allies are openly, actively, extensively using it. When you bring it forward, as you talked about drugs after war, marijuana has a significant place in the conversation now. The government, again, has a set of policies that don't align with the human behaviors of the population the government serves. And what I mean by that is veterans come home and they go to the VA, and many of the veterans have a number of problems in which substances, whether illicitly obtained or legally prescribed, are seen as part of the common remedy. And the VA will prescribe all manner of drugs to the former rank and file, to the veterans, antidepressants, mood stabilizers, opiates for pain. But because marijuana is a Schedule I controlled substance by the DEA, federally the VA cannot administer marijuana, even though jurisdictionally many veterans live in states like Rhode Island that have medical marijuana programs that make marijuana quite accessible legally. And the VA won't deny care to someone who's using marijuana, a veteran, but they cannot be involved in the prescription, which creates pretty disheartening circumstances for many veterans. I know veterans who live in states that don't have medical marijuana, and they risk legal action going out and getting it on the street. I'm not here to say marijuana is necessarily, a universal panacea for many of the afflictions that veterans suffer when they come home, because I think the science on that is mixed and individual experiences really vary. For some people find it helps and others don't. And self-prescription has its pitfalls. It's very hard to get it regulated just right in a way that, a consistently produced pharmaceutical product is more easy to regulate because the product is the same from event to event, from dose to dose. So I'm not here to advocate the marijuana position, but I am here to say that it's deeply confusing for veterans that they are heavily prescribed with opiates and other drugs, but do not have any formal counseling on the use of medical marijuana, which many of them finds alleviates their symptoms. And I would add that opiates and veterans, some of the studies have shown, can lead to, like twice the rate of overdose among the veteran population. So it is a fair question to say how responsible this policy is for the administration of the medical care of our veterans when they have this access and, you could argue, encouragement to use opiates, which they feel, with some justification and data in their corner, are much more dangerous than marijuana. And my 10 minutes are up. And it's your turn.
Well, first of all, I have to say that I'm very happy to be here today. So I graduated here, and it's just fantastic to be home. I was Peter's student, so needless to say, I'm honored to be commenting his book today. His work had an enormous intellectual influence on me and on the work I do. So needless to say, I like his book. And as I have enjoyed his other books, but I have always admired Peter's intellectual rigor and the ability that he has to tackle big questions, but in clear, simple language. And I think that that's, like in his other books, in this book, that's very clear. This is a book that is presented for a wider audience. And I think that, like Paul Gutenberg says in the jacket of the book, this is the work of a public intellectual, but with analytic rigor. And I think that's something that characterizes your work, and I think that makes it fabulous. I think this book also builds on and continues things that Peter has already explored in his previous books and in his previous work, and I will say, and actually he mentions it at the end of the book, but there are like three main blocks that I think are in this book and that appear in the rest of his work. The first one is this call to basically go back to history to think about problems of violence, of illicit markets, and I think that's such an important thing because we tend to exaggerate anything that has to do with violence, anything that has to do with illicit markets, with drugs. So Peter's ability to go back to history and show us that problems that we tend to consider always as new are never new and actually have deep-rooted history is very important. The second point that I think is part of his work and appears here again is how the state plays such an important role in creating and recreating the problems that it aims to solve. So the state is a very important protagonist of this book, as it has been in others of Peter's works, which is essential, again, because when we think about illicit markets, when we think about, especially today, we think of non-state actors, and the state tends to be thought about something that is isolated. And Peter's work really has been, I think, influential for many people like me to really think about the state as deeply immersed in the dynamics of illicit markets and in the dynamics of violence. I think the third element that is clear in this book that has been clear in others of Peter's works is that he really has this ability to question simplistic and exaggerated ideas, and he does it elegantly and he does it very effectively. And all those elements are present in this book. I think that this book is taking on questioning another conventional wisdom, and Peter mentioned it at the beginning, which is this historic amnesia about the way we think about new wars. And I think he's implicitly taking with a debate with this literature, and I'm sure you probably didn't want to take a disciplinary debate, but in political science, and I think outside of political science, very influential literature talking about new wars and how after the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union, what we have seen is the emergence of these kind of wars that are mostly non-state, that tend to be brutal, that tend to be unregulated, irrational, and that they tend to be mostly motivated by profit. And this whole greed and grievance debate, which is basically the idea that many of the wars that we see inside the states are mostly motivated because of illicit profits. And I think that Peter is implicitly taking on a debate against this literature by telling us, hey, this relationship between illicit drugs and war is not just about non-state actors, and is not just about crazy armies in developing countries. And I think that that's a key part of this book. And so Peter is showing us that this connection between wars and drugs is very old, is multifaceted, and that it permeates not only the illicit drugs of today, but of course the drugs that we probably will never admit that we are addicted to coffee as a drug, right? And Peter really, I think, challenges us to think about coffee alongside these other more negatively seen drugs, right? Like cocaine or methamphetamines or opium. And in some ways, coffee is the one that seems to be like the oldest bird in this book, because if we think about alcohol, nicotine, methamphetamines, opium, and cocaine, those are drugs that have like bigger psychoactive effects, and they are not as widely used. But I think Peter really is able to convince us that coffee does belong in this group, and that it does belong because the way that it expanded is tightly connected to war and to war making, and that history of war of coffee drinking really becoming and becoming widespread really after war is fascinating. The history of Coca-Cola in the book is also fascinating, how basically the brand really becomes much more popular because of war. And I think that that's a fascinating story, and it's one that really kind of pushes us to think like coffee does really belong in this history, because it's a psychoactive substance, and it's a psychoactive substance that has expanded through war, and that has influenced the behavior of people in wars. So I think that that's very interesting. There is a short mention about coffee in Central America, which I think is very important too, right? Like showing that in certain places, the way that these drugs are being produced and the way that they are being, the property around the production of these drugs can also be a source of war, what he calls the war through drugs, right? And so I have to say that in that regard, one of the most fascinating chapters, I mean, every chapter in this book is fascinating, but I love the chapter on methamphetamines, because there is so much there that is new and it's interesting. And so basically just Peter is telling us this story about how methamphetamines and the use of methamphetamines was really spread through wars, especially World War II. And that history, I think, hasn't been told well until now, when he's kind of putting it together and telling it. And thinking about how we compare and think about these 6 drugs, I think the comparison between cocaine, methamphetamines, and opium is really interesting. So one thing and one contrast that I found really fascinating when reading the book is the fact that cocaine and methamphetamines are very similar in many regards. They have, you can say, in some ways they are comparable in the types of effects they create on the users. They are also comparable in the sense that there is not as much widespread use as you will see in alcohol or in tobacco, yet they end up having 2 very different destinies, right? So methamphetamines take off right after World War II, but the fate of cocaine is being illegal and becoming successful as an illegal market, but kind of becoming completely separated from the state. And I think for the discussion, it would just be interesting to hear more from you about why you think that's the case, because I think there are some potential explanations, but it's actually not straightforward. You will think, well, maybe there were more influence from the pharmaceutical companies in methamphetamine production that was part of the story, but pharmaceutical companies also played a very important role with cocaine, especially at the beginning of the century. So I think that that's a really interesting question that came up to me as I was reading the book. I think another common thread throughout the book is, and again, this is something that I think echoes Peter's previous work, is the paradoxes of the role of the state in regulating these markets and in intervening here. And I think Peter shows really well that there is never like kind of a clear black and white story about who's the good and the bad in these stories. And I think that's always very useful when we're thinking about war and when we're thinking about illicit markets. So he chose in many ways how bans have always ended up being very unsuccessful, right? So we think about the bans on, or the war on drugs, but it's more than that, right? So he shows the ultimate failure of different bans, from the ban of tobacco in Persia or in Japan in the 1600s to the ban on coffee houses by King Charles II in 1675, for different reasons, right? And all those end up being unsuccessful because there is a strong pushback from the users, but also from the people who are profiting from those markets. And of course, inevitably, that takes us to today and thinking, okay, there is so much debate right now about drug reform, but we talk mostly about marijuana, right? And I think there is a reason for that, and it's the fact that there is more widespread use, right? Like the constituencies are different. And as much as I was reading the book and I was saying, yeah, like we have an entire history of bans failing to do what they intend to do, and that can be applied to the war on drugs today. But at the same time, it doesn't seem that whatever brought those bans to an end before can be applied at least for the hardest drugs, to heroin and cocaine today. So I was just kind of, again, another idea for thinking about, like, knowing what we know from this history of wars and drugs, and knowing what we know about how basically what ends up happening after many of these wars is that there is a push for them to move forward because there are not enough forces to keep them controlled. But that doesn't seem to be the case that that's going to happen to cocaine ever, I think, so, or to heroin. So it will be just interesting to hear about it. I think, I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I'm going to be close to finish here. Another thing that was very interesting from this book, and I think Peter never says it like openly, this is what I tend to do, but he doesn't, I think, for a reason, which is the focus on major powers in history, but basically on major wars and major powers. There are some references to developing countries at different points throughout the book, but really this is a history of how major powers, Western powers, but not only Western, China, Russia, like the major powers in the world have been a kind of a central part of this story. And I think this is essential because this is really what challenges this narrative that we have that is driven by what has happened in the last 2 or 3 decades, which is a story of non-state actors and developing countries, but really in the long run of history is a story about major powers in major wars and wars between states. So I think that that's a driving force of how Peter chose the cases that appear in this book, but I'm kind of curious also to hear more about how you ended up choosing the stories that appear in this book, because I'm sure you had a lot of stories to choose from. And one thing that is fascinating about this book is that I'm highlighting ideas, but I'm also highlighting stories, because the pieces of the stories that appear in this book is the kind of thing that you want to tell in a cocktail party or in a class, saying, okay, this is what will lead you to think differently about the relationship between wars and drugs. And so yeah, I think that was I would have to say that I love the idea of calling Great Britain the first narco state, and it's a statement, and I think it's a very important statement. And I wanted to close just with one last question and one last reflection, which is, as I said at the beginning, I think one of the major contribution from Peter's work is this push to look back to history, to really rethink and question some of the ways in which we think about current problems. And I think personally, I see how when we go back to history and see that things that we think are new are not so new, give us a lot of elements to think, okay, what mistakes not to make again? Or it really provides a lot of food for thought, but also a lot of elements to rethink how we think about problems that are major today. At the same time, I've kind of faced skepticism from people sometimes saying, we can look back to history, but we don't care about history. We care about what to do in the future. And you look back to history, but you are engaged in policy discussions. And I just want to hear a little bit of how people react, or how you try to connect this when what you're talking about and you're asked to provide policy recommendations or policy ideas. And I will stop there. Thank you.
I'm eager to hear more from Peter, as I'm sure most of you are, so let me just make a few brief comments. What I was most impressed about from this book even goes beyond the subject matter, which is the whole approach of trying to look at history in a new way. That's one of the most exciting parts of the business that we're in. Facts don't change, but we understand facts differently as time passes, and we get to rearrange facts. That's one of the thrilling parts of our job, and that's, I think, the great category of research into which this book fits. It gives us a new way to understand where we've been and where we are now. We understand from this book that drugs are both a tool of war and also a reason for war. And I think the combination of those two highlights the importance of this theme. I want to pick up on something that Chris said. He used the word hypocrisy. And that's a theme that shines right through this book in so many different ways. I would build on what Chris said and said there's also a tremendous hypocrisy in the way governments deal with drugs. On the one hand, denouncing and condemning them, on the other hand, using them as tools for their own political purposes internationally. We use those drugs not only as motivations, but as inspirations for what we can get, what's out there for us, and how we can get it. This hypocrisy extends to our tolerance of drug traffickers from other countries. Just as we decide which countries we don't like, and then we figure out, oh, that must be a terrorist, and we find a way to make them into a terrorist. And other terrorists who we like, we go out, bend over backwards to try to pretend that they're actually paladins of democracy. The same thing happens with drug lords. I had a vivid experience I'll never forget with one of my favorite drug lords, one of the only ones that I really got to know, and that was Manuel Noriega, the Panamanian leader in the 1980s. I'll never forget having an interview with Noriega and telling him a little bit uncomfortably, but that's my job as a reporter, that there have been many reports that you've been deeply involved in drug trafficking, and therefore I have to ask you, how do you respond to those reports? And so he kind of smiled and he gestured over one of his aides, and the aide had a briefcase. Noriega looks through it and he pulls out from a folder a letter, and he hands it over to me. And the letter is on the letterhead of the Drug Enforcement Administration. And it says, "Dear General Noriega, we want to thank you so much for all the help you've given us in controlling the drug traffic in the Caribbean Basin." Signed, John Lawn, Director of the Drug Enforcement Administration. Now, if we all knew Noriega was a drug trafficker, the DEA certainly knew. But Noriega had a great game going. He was working for one cartel. And when the other cartel would try to use Panama, he would find out about it and call the DEA. They would then be able to boast of a great big bust. And meanwhile, Noriega was funneling large amounts of cocaine with the full knowledge, I'm sure, of the DEA through other channels. Also in the 1980s, I remember sitting in Nicaragua where I was living then. There were a lot of reports that the Sandinistas were financing their war in part by shipping cocaine out, and that the Contras were doing the same thing. We didn't have the detailed information to speculate or to report on that, but when we spoke among ourselves, our answer always was, how could they not? It's a poor country. You need lots of money. You've got a fantastic market with piles of money just a few miles away on an illicit plane flight, so I have no doubt that that was a substantial contributor to the wars in Central America. I think those of us that have seen combat understand that war is much more chaotic than it sometimes seems to be when you're watching it in movies or when you're reading about it. The act of going out and participating in a war violates so many deep instincts and impulses and principles inside every human being. I do think this might be one of the reasons why drugs become important. The reality of war is too awful to face. So these drugs actually help people face something that in a normal life you wouldn't want to face and you wouldn't want to be able to face. But it's very important for governments that soldiers be able to face them. So I think that helps wipe away any objections that governing forces might have to the use of those drugs. Chris also mentioned Vietnam, and it's absolutely true that was a turning point in the U.S. military. That's when we not only went from a very drug-fueled military to one that was drug-controlled through urinalysis, but that was also, not coincidentally, the time when we moved away from a volunteer army towards, from a draftee army to a voluntary army. This is another big result of drug use in the military. And the fact that we now have an all-volunteer army is definitely a great enabling factor for our government when it wants to prosecute wars, because it's a lot easier to do so, needless to say, when people are not worried about the draft. When I first started the book, I was wondering why Peter didn't use sugar as one of his drugs. But then when I got to the rum part, I came to realize, yeah, he did use sugar. It's just it wrapped up in an even larger drug. In my last book, I wrote about U.S. Army efforts to develop LSD as a weapon of war. And they actually had the idea that they could dump huge amounts of it on enemy populations and everybody would love them and they would think their rifles were hydrangeas and that the enemy was just their blood relatives and they wouldn't shoot at them. But actually, this turned out not to work. That's the reason it's not in this book. The effects of LSD, too unpredictable to be used effectively as a weapon of war. I also think that this combination of factors that Peter has so brilliantly highlighted in this book still play out today in many ways, from very small to very big. I've been told by intelligence officers that worked in Afghanistan trying to pick out which are the huts that they have to have night raids against because somebody's living in there that we want to get. One of the things they tell them is, as your intelligence guy's walking through the village, look and see if there are huts where there's no cigarette butts outside. That's probably somebody in the Taliban. So the Taliban might have picked up on that by now. Maybe they distribute cigarette butts to people to drop outside their homes, but that was certainly a factor. And I want to go on and also mention the fact that one of our principal foreign policy tools now, as has been for several decades, are sanctions. We like to sanction governments so they can't freely export or import. Their economies are greatly constricted. So I've lived personally through two strong episodes of this that I covered in Yugoslavia and then again in Iraq. Those were both situations in which governments were pressed to move towards illegal sources of income. And because of sanctions, those governments turned in part to drug trafficking. And there's no better example of this than North Korea, which is a major industrial exporter of illegal drugs, and it does so largely because it's not able to have other kinds of economic activity. We certainly wouldn't want to ignore the role of opium and other drugs in building up New England and building up our economy. It was the trade from New England merchants that provided the capital for all the factories that made New England such a world power. So from this book, I take away a new lens in looking at history. Just to give one example, so I spend some time thinking about and writing about Iran. Why does Iran have a government like it does today? Well, there was a revolution 40 years ago. Why did that revolution happen? Because people felt that the old government was not respecting their democracy. Where did the idea of their democracy come from? It came from the 1906 constitutional revolution in Iran. What set off the constitutional revolution in Iran? The tobacco revolt. It was when the British insisted, and the Shah of Iran, being bribed by the British, agreed to give the British company, a British tobacco company, monopoly control over the entire tobacco industry and forbid every Iranian from growing or producing or selling tobacco, that an explosion happened. Even the harem women, the Shah's harem women, refused to smoke as a result of the fatwa handed down by the leading religious figure in Iran. So if you trace it all back, the entire crisis in Iran was set off by rebellion about tobacco. Once you begin to realize that, you understand how much of history remains to be explained in a new way and how valuable are people whose insights are such that they allow us to find a new lens to understand circumstances that we thought we already understood. And for that, I really applaud you, Peter. Thank you.
floor's open. Jim.
Peter, wonderful book, and no one mentioned that it's lavishly illustrated. So the story is also told
Right.
through pictures. Sorry. No one told us on the panel that it's lavishly illustrated, this book, through pictures and so forth. You tell the story. But this is a point that several people mentioned implicitly. Incredible irony, complexity, history, is that you want us to take home a message. The only messages I can get are don't go to war and stop the hypocrisy. But you might have something a little bit more. What would you advise countries, having learned and studied so deeply this history?
Right to the policy implications.
Yeah. Watson Institute.
Right. Should I go ahead and answer that? All right. I have to say, of all the things I've written, this is the book where I'm more stumped than usual on sort of what the actual direct, explicit policy recommendation is, because a radical one would be if you actually take seriously that you don't want illicit drugs funding terrorists and insurgents and traffickers who have private armies, is drug legalization. I mean, that's a logical conclusion one can reach from this book. I don't go there, but it's an understandable avenue of inquiry because the source of the funding today is illicit drugs. Drugs that at one point in history weren't illicit, but the more illicit the drug becomes, the more it's the domain of profiteering by non-state actors, and the less it's taxable by authorities. Historically, authorities have used drug revenue to pay for armies and all sorts of things, but now it's warlords, the Taliban, insurgents, terrorists, and so on. So if that's your priority, the war on terror, the war on traffickers, it's legalization, but obviously the legalization debate is much more complicated than that. And so, for example, cannabis legalization, which has moved the furthest, including places like Rhode Island, but also especially north of here, Massachusetts and elsewhere, it helps, but it's not the major funder of violence and insurgents and terror the way that cocaine and opium is. In the back.
Could you give another one too, so we can get the second one ready?
I'm sorry, what? Get
A second one, so we can give them the mic.
sure.
I haven't read the book. I'm sorry, go ahead. I haven't read the book, so I don't know everything's in there. But
There's copies outside.
I do want to congratulate you on parsing the myriad ways in which wars and drugs intersect. But I have a comment and a question. Comment, I was a little surprised nobody mentioned the etymological basis of the words assassin and assassination, which is hashish.
Right.
Probably in your book. But my question goes back to how often, I mean, the opium wars are a prime example, but how often are drugs the either overt or covert reason for a particular war? And I'm not talking about non-state entities, but actual nation states or equivalent.
Right. Just on the first thing you mentioned, hashish and assassins, it's a famous story. I don't include it partly because there's actually debate over there whether it's pure myth, that it's just part of folklore, and so I don't go there because just the evidence is thin, and in fact much of the discussion of it is that it's a mythical story that people like to tell. The second question, or actually your main question, is one of the relationships that I unpack and identify as war for drugs. And this is where I think it's very important to distinguish between war for drugs versus war through drugs, because in the current policy debate, and this gets to Jim's issue of the policy discussions, I actually think war through drugs overwhelms the importance of war for drugs, both historically and today. There's always exceptions, and it varies in range, but for the most part, drugs have been this extraordinarily potent, literally, facilitator of warfare. But the cases where you can really point to an explicit that's why they went to war was drugs are much more rare. So the opium wars are the first things that comes to mind. But there's a reason that we always fall back on the opium wars as the sort of prime historical example of this. But all the way up to the present, I think today it's the war for drugs is largely in the realm of illicit drugs, and it's largely in places such as Mexico. Ashu.
Peter, I also have a question about opium wars, partly because I taught it this morning. Not the China side of it as much as the tea-opium connection under East India Company, and your description that British maritime power was mobilized to support a private company. So there was an interesting combination here between state power and private power, and for the two opium wars. Now the question is this: the data that has emerged from economic history over the last 40 years, and most of it out of economic history as a subdiscipline in America is dead. But economic history continues to be a vibrant discipline in Europe. So there are new estimates that have emerged about the proportion of, let's say, manufacturing, world manufacturing in different parts of the world. Agricultural data for 1700 or 1600 is virtually impossible to estimate, right? But manufacturing has been estimated. So here is what we have about what happened to China after opium wars. I'm not claiming that opium wars led to the decline of Chinese economy, but just to give you some sense of what the correlations are, not causality. Until 1800, China produced 1/3 of the world's entire manufacturing output until 1800. And what we call the West today had only 1/4 of the world's manufacturing output. By 1860, which is when the second opium war is more or less ending, China is down to 19.7, and then there's a steep decline after the second opium war. And China's share of world's manufacturing output by 1900 is 6.2. Down from 33% in 1800 to 6.2 in 1900. Whereas what we call the West again, it rises from 18.2 in 1750 to 77.4 in 1900. The question is this: are there other examples you know where wars over drugs either led to or were correlated with such steep economic declines as we saw in China? And notice even in the Chinese literature or Chinese popular discourse, this whole idea of 100 years of humiliation begins with the opium wars and the decline that China saw after the two opium wars. Are there other such cases of steep economic decline correlated with, if not caused by wars over drugs?
There may be, but I can't think of a case that's remotely close to as extreme a case. Having said that, I'm wary of pointing to a unitary causal relationship between those outcomes that you point to and opium. It's correlation, as you teach and know, is not causation. Opium's a culprit. But one of the lessons of this book, the book hits you over the head on the importance of drugs in relationship to war. At the end of the day, there is a warning to readers saying, I also don't want you to drug the analysis. It's not drugs, 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 right? So I'm wary of basically saying, look what happened to China during the 100 years after the opium wars. It's all because of opium. It's a lot more complicated than that. But opium is certainly a culprit and an important culprit. And one thing fascinating about the opium wars is that after the second opium war, China actually threw in the towel so much that it basically did import substitution industrialization. It basically became itself the largest producer of opium in the world. It said we can't keep out Indian imports of opium. We'll just legalize the stuff and produce it ourselves. So at the turn of the century, by 1900, China's the world's largest consumer and producer of opium. But the economic decline that you point to, first of all, is, it's relative to other places rising. So that's also problematic. But opium's certainly a big culprit. But I would say the most important impact of opium on China is Chinese identity and the psychology of thinking of being poisoned by the outside world, and anti-imperialism has basically paved the way for the Chinese Revolution in a substantial way. Oh, I should add, one of the biggest losers of the Chinese Revolution is opium. China led the most sweeping, draconian, and most effective war against drugs the world has ever seen. Basically, virtually wiped out opium from China, given its previous 100-year history, and it's precisely for that reason that the drug moved south into the Golden Triangle of Southeast Asia.
Just one follow-up.
Thank you all for sharing. I personally immediately jumped when I started hearing about Killer High to the 60s and the role of especially LSD in the anti-drug movement. And I think today we're seeing the resurgence of a lot of those ideas of the 60s, especially when it comes to hallucinogenic drugs. Both marijuana, the new breakthrough status on both psilocybin mushrooms as well as on MDMA. And I just love your perspective on how do hallucinogenic drugs of the 60s and all the way up to today sort of fit into that discussion.
Great question. I explain in the introduction why I pick certain drugs and why I actually largely ignore other drugs. So it's a history of war in 6 drugs, not 7 or 8 or 9. And hallucinogenic drugs don't make the cut. And for all sorts of reasons, some of which you might imagine, they're not particularly effective on the battlefield. States have never figured out how to tax them and make revenue. They tend to be very niche drugs. And as you mentioned, in some cases, kind of considered an anti-war drug. That was certainly true of cannabis in the 60s. Stephen Kinzer has shown in his most recent book so brilliantly, as it was certainly researched and experimented on as a mind control drug and as a weapon of war by the CIA, but that still didn't rise it to the status of a sort of globally commercialized, mass consumption, popular, profitable drug the way these others are. One thing that I think is going to grow in importance is, Chris mentioned returning GIs and turning to various drugs and coping with the aftermath of war. Well, there's actually growing research showing that, one of the most effective treatments for PTSD is basically microdosing of MDMA. And there's a push to get the DA to reschedule it and be able to use it for medical purposes. I don't know how far that's going to get or whether we can project in the future, but frankly, sitting here 10 years ago, no one would have predicted the legalization of marijuana. So it's possible that actually we'll see a proliferation of what you just described as the present moment. Ed.
Again, Peter, it's such provocative work. I really love it. But let me ask you to make some comparisons to 2 other kinds of addictions that don't involve psychoactive substances, as far as I know. So, we do talk about the addiction to oil and conflicts surrounding oil, and what are the parallels? Maybe they don't exist between drug wars and oil-related wars. Of course, they're both resource-related, but I'm interested in those parallels. But also maybe a different kind of addiction, social media, Facebook, kind of the juice you get from this, the ability of that kind of commerce to manipulate people, and we're seeing now cause conflict potentially between countries. So can you draw parallels across psychoactive substances and war, energy resources, oil and war, and a different kind of commercial product, whatever it is, social media?
Great question. I don't go there in the book. I could, perhaps in the conclusion, make these kind of linkages, and perhaps I should have. one dimension of the relationship between war and drugs is what I emphasize, war through drugs, and another one is war for drugs. And those are the two dimensions where you can most clearly see, well, it's just yet another example of resource wars, right? So oil, war for oil, war through oil, right? So in that regard, it's part of a larger universe of using profitable commodities to generate revenue for war making. Not a particularly unfamiliar story, but a hugely important one, right? So I think, as Stephen Kinzer said, in Central America, they were like, well, it's the most profitable thing going. Well, that's what they'll use in the 1980s. So why wouldn't they? So in that sense, there's a pragmatism. You use whatever revenue on whatever commodity is available, regardless of the legal status of the thing. So the oil comparison. Comparing it to sort of the other things you mentioned, social media, there's a terrific...
Freedom data and surveillance and all
Yeah.
surrounding that world.
I'll punt a little bit and say David Courtwright's new book, he's probably one of the better known drug historians, just has a new book out last year or so called The Age of Addiction. And it basically does take this big, ambitious sweep at sort of, the modern world in terms of the various things we're addicted to, including video games and so on. I don't go there, but it's provocative reading, and I certainly recommend it to others. That I do conclude the book. One thing I do go out on a limb a little bit in the last page of the book is to say, I've talked about all these relationships between war and drugs, but maybe we should also think of war itself, war as drug, right? Because actually, some of the psychoactive effects of war can be considered drug-like. The adrenaline rush. Anyone seen The Hurt Locker? I mean, that is a case of addiction, right? He's shot at the end of the movie. He's back in suburbia shopping at the store. And then he goes and re-enlists, right? Others, war journalists who've gone out. Chris Hedges has actually wrote a book where he basically literally describes the rush of war as a drug, and there's plenty of memoirs and diaries from soldiers to generals sort of describing the effect as an equivalent of addiction.
Time for maybe one or two more questions. And if is there one back?
In the back.
Thank you. Okay, so I guess to keep it brief, the question that I was holding on to was if there was anybody that was doing anything with addiction science, like if you had to name one person that was doing something revolutionary there, that would be, where you'd find something else, like some other approach to the idea of addiction that you'd find maybe clinically or just generally written about, I guess, and that might be Mr. Court.
David Courtwright, book called The Age of Addiction. He's a historian, but he takes it all the way back centuries, but he brings it right to the present. But I would not point to one person as sort of the addiction expert. There's enormous literature on this. I do know that there is a considerable amount of research going on, and there should be a lot more funded in terms of the nature of addiction and the very idea of an addiction vaccine, interestingly enough, for some drugs is a possibility down the road. But so I don't have a name for you, unfortunately.
Oh, well, right on. I guess I meant to recognize that it already sort of been answered in the last question, which was sort of satisfying. And very grateful for that. And there was one other bit. Yeah, I guess the effect of the opium war on China and looking at the causality of opium, and it just, I guess it's a comment too, that it just seemed that it was more like if anything was the cause, it would have been the war. It would have been war, not drugs that have been the cause, and sort of war through drugs. And then it just seemed that you almost drugged war in the last bit by saying that looking at war as a drug. The same, I just remember a comment like, and try not to drug, maybe drug the analysis. So I just found that interesting. I don't know. So, Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Peter, I did want to ask you if you could I'm just curious about your explanation for the methamphetamine versus cocaine story.
Oh, right, yes. Maybe we should conclude by letting the panelists say something. I appreciate you pushing me on that. Your great question, why cocaine did not take off on the battlefield the way methamphetamines did. It actually made an appearance in World War II, and there's plenty of evidence of it, but then major states turn against cocaine, led by the U.S., but Britain did too, to basically move against cocaine, including with soldier use. I mean, Sigmund Freud was a big fan of cocaine, and he basically first became aware of it because the Germans were testing it on soldiers and thought it was this magical wonder drug. It's a perfect example of it's much easier to identify how something changed and that it changed factually versus why exactly. Because cocaine basically, because of it becomes more criminalized status in the 20th century, therefore much less used for functional purposes on the battlefield. In fact, now that you asked me about this, there were efforts, suggestions that the U.S. military study the positive effects of coca on mild, basically the raw material for cocaine, but it's very mild stimulant, and the U.S. was such an anti-drug mode that it squashed any research on coca, even though for many centuries, Peruvian soldiers had found it to be incredible energy boosting and hunger reducing. It does open the door for amphetamines because basically amphetamines, in fact, what's interesting is when amphetamines become criminalized in the U.S. in the 1960s, that's actually when cocaine takes off because a lot of people do turn to cocaine recreationally when amphetamines become much less available.
Final comments from the panel?
Well, my one comment is something that you mentioned. It's nice when the book has its high point on the last page. And I agree with that observation about war as a drug. But I would say, from my perspective, yeah, it is a drug. It is addictive for some people on the battlefield, including people that are fighting and people that are watching the fighting. But I also think it's addictive at a higher level. It's addictive for the generals. Yeah. It's addictive for the politicians. It's such a great political benefit. It pays off in so many ways, the promotion of war. So I feel that addiction to war at that level is actually more pernicious even than the individual addiction of war to people that are actually seeing it unfold.
It all depends how we define addiction, of course, but anyway, go ahead.
And from the public too, right? Like the consumption of violence is so high in the media. No, I will just say, and with inviting everybody to read it, I didn't say this when I was talking, but I assigned your work because it's very easy for students to read and still get a very deep understanding of things. And your last comment to my question just makes me think that geopolitics still plays such an important role, and maybe the reason why cocaine ended up the way it did and methamphetamines didn't is because coca was coming from Latin America mostly, so that there was a very deeply embedded geopolitical relation there. So, but thank you so much.
So I'm not a historian, but I'm an observer and chronicler of modern military activity. And this book is very valuable for that and sort of underlined some of my own experiences. I mean, if you really want to see, and there's many sort of angles of inquiry to observe and document the failures of the modern American military, one of the surefire places, though, to do this, one of the themes to look at is in its work against drugs in Afghanistan. I mean, it was astonishing. One of the surest ways to get in a gunfight in Afghanistan was to go out with a unit doing counter-narcotics work. This was not ideological. It was practical, because to go and try to burn a poppy field is to essentially impact a hillbilly economy with top cover. And so the American military realized this pretty quickly at the operational level, down at the field commanders, and they stopped doing it. They tolerated it. although there still was officially an effort to reduce the amount of opium poppy production in Afghanistan, at the practical level, most units knew better than to try. They didn't want to lose people to this, and lose a lot of people. And there was a doctrinal contradiction in that counterinsurgency, you're supposed to get along with the local population. But if you're attacking the local population's wartime economy, which was often opium-based, because opium, unlike tomatoes or melons, is an enduring product that you can hold on to until the road is open. It's not perishable. And so naturally, in a war climate, opium was being grown very heavily in the areas that could grow opium because of climate and water access. And the Americans just left it alone, or they would engage in, as the American military often does, activities that look like accomplishment but actually are not. So you could go see opium fields being burned, but the fields already would have been harvested. And there'd be no gunfight because they would pay the farmer to let the field be burned, but he'd already removed his product and you're burning the stubble. And that was a very safe patrol to go on. It was also a farce, an absolute farce. And it was a common one. And you could also find very reliably in the areas where opium was being grown, places where it would be almost certainly grown, and that was inside the grounds of an Afghan police station. And that's just kind of how the way it was, and this book brings that home really well, and I commend and recommend it both.
Thank you. There's books outside.